Something I've spoken about a surprisingly small amount in this channel is just how phenomenally well done the Ben 10 villains are. So to celebrate just how great they are, I wanted to go over the way they're portrayed and written, and work out what makes a good Ben 10 villain. And at the end of this video, I'll be using that framework I've worked out to create a villain in a similar vein to what the showrunners have done time and time again. So the first major commonality I've noticed with most of Ben's rogue gallery is the pursuit of some form of power. Whether that be something tangible like the Omnitrix in Vilgax's case, or the charms of Bazel or the Alpha Room with Charmcaster and Hex. Or something more akin to a power boost or a transformation like we see from Malware in his red form or Aggregor in his ultimate form. Beyond that, absorbing or gaining some form of power is a real theme for the villains in this show. Early villains like Bozo absorbed people's life energy to feed off of. Same with one of the first villains in the Alien Force series with Micah Morningstar. Both siphoning off others as a way to feed themselves, but also over-consuming for the thrill of it. Though that later changes for Michael Morningstar when he becomes Darkstar, feeding less for overabundance of energy and more so seeking to maintain his more visually pleasing base appearance. Back to that transformation idea. Pretty early on, you've got the Ghost Rick transformation reveal. Same goes with Vilgax, sort of. You've got the damaged form we see for nearly the entirety of Season 1, before we get the big hulking form that appears in Secrets. Even with lower level threat villains like Rojo, we have the transformation aspect. The idea of transformation is also present to an extent with Animo in his future iterations, with these more monstrous forms that appear across the classic and Omniverse. Though he does have a bit of a visual change in Alien Force, but I wouldn't quite call that a transformation in the same sense. Speaking of Omniverse, the Brooders come pre-transformed with their first appearance. Although back to Classic for a moment, we do literally get a transformation sequence other than with Ben, with Dr. Victor's transformation into his Transilian form. What I'm getting at here is there is a real underlying theme of change and transformation a lot of Ben 10 villains share. It's certainly a clear parallel between them and Ben's transformations. Then there's a more literal parallel between Ben and Albedo, a villain who's forcibly transformed into Ben, at least physically, though he later does regain access to his Galvan form along with his ultimate transformation. Something I have sort of worked out writing this is that most of Ben's villains typically fall into one of four categories. You've got the general criminals and goons who, whatever species they are, tend to do lower level crimes or collaborate with bigger bads. Then you've got the sort of monster of the week villains, if you want to call it that. Think of the Big Tick, Arpak, the Dragon, Prisoner 775, or the Nalgene Destructor, though those are more antagonistic characters or forces rather than anyone with a particularly villainous intent. Then we get the two major types of villains in the franchise, who are those who have different ties to one of the main characters or the Omnitrix itself. Think Aggregor, Ragnarok, or the Rooters with Kevin, or Charmcaster Hex, or Adwacia with Gwen. Then you've got the major portion of this category, which don't revolve around Ben as much as they usually do the Omnitrix. Obviously you've got Vilgax, who's after the device itself, Dr. Animo, who's obsessed with utilising the DNA inside the Omnitrix. Then you've got characters like Albedo or Malware who want to utilise it for themselves. And these are all just the ones that come to mind when I'm first thinking about it. Then there's the last category villains tend to fall into, and that's villains who are just sort of doing their own thing and our protagonists get in their way. Though characters from other categories often overlap with this one as well, particularly recurring villains tend to eventually find their way into this category if they weren't there in the first place. Perfect example to me is, while relating to a character like Kevin, Aggregor was really just trying to do his own thing. He didn't really have any tie to the main cast other than happening to be an Osmosian. Same goes for Maltruant. Even though he ends up being cosmically tied to Ben in a never-ending loop, he really didn't actively have a vendetta with the main cast. I'd say the largest example of this is with the DNA aliens and the Hybrid. They have no regard for Ben or the main trio whatsoever. The main trio are more of a thorn in their side than anything. Moving on from categories to themes in general, you tend to find villains in media generally, but especially in Ben 10, out for revenge. I'd say the most major examples of this was the scare against Ben after being trapped inside the Omnitrix and subsequently being defeated by him. Same goes with Charmcaster wanting revenge against Gwen, though both of those villains sort of move away from this idea towards the end of the series and more just dislike the character as opposed to wanting to actively seek revenge. The most major trend I see with villains in Ben 10, and I sort of touched on this earlier, is their obsession with power driving them. I touched on this earlier with transformations and power-ups, but I think the never-ending pursuit of strength is especially prominent in our next two characters. Going back to Classic for a moment here, we've got my personal favourite villain in Kevin, who in the original series is constantly wanting more. Actually, it's a really nice arc seeing his gradual evolution across the three major series. I really like where he started, but I ended up loving the character he became come Omniverse, which is a real testament to the team behind this series given how different those two characters feel, or those two versions of the same character feel. Getting back to his more troubled era though, in Classic he's already obsessed with getting revenge against the other street toughs in the city he lives in. Then when he gets the tools to get that revenge, he immediately tried to kill them off with his partial transformation of Heat Blast. After being defeated by Ben, he becomes obsessed with ruining his life next. He goes on to impersonate Ben, actively profiting while destroying the reputation of Ben's alien transformations. Then the Ben 10 version of Karma hits him, and in his anger he loses the ability to regulate the DNA he absorbed, and is left in his first amalgam form, which leads him to becoming even more fixated on Ben, actively hunting him down. He becomes so self-destructive here, actively putting himself in harm's way to get any chance at hurting Ben. This results in Kevin teaming up with the next villain whose obsession with power and revenge gets the better of him, with Vilgax, who's just forever going through power-up after power-up, at least pre-omniverse, in order to get his revenge. He's driven by a desire to conquer, which lands him in that sort of doing his own thing category, only to be beaten by a time-travelling Ben wielding the Omnitrix, giving him that obsession with the device in the first place, wanting to create an army of Omnitrix wielders under his command, which eventually leads him to actively pursuing Ben, only to be defeated by him alongside Grandpa Max and Gwen, then make a series of returns only to be beaten by him time and time again. Then between the classic series and Omniverse, he goes around defeating powerful opponents using a device to absorb their strength to bolster his own, along with going around collecting powerful artifacts in what I'm now realising feels very Thanos or Doctor Doom of him, only to still be defeated by Ben again. Then later he pulls a very Margin Vegeta style move and chooses to become a vessel of the Dagon for another power boost, and then gets another power boost when he gets a hold of Ascalon, only to yet again be defeated by Ben. I was going to say come Omniverse he quits the habit of getting a new power up and challenging Ben, but this isn't true. You've then got his return as Malgax, wearing another villain as power armor. Actually, that's another trend of villains in this series, working alongside Vilgax. You've got his original team up with Kevin, his team up with Albedo, then Eon and Malware, and each time he blatantly uses the other villain only to quite predictably betray them afterwards. Kevin the least so. He turns against Albedo the moment he gets a hold of the Omnitrix, he erases Eon from existence, and he literally uses Malware as a suit. What I'm getting at here is there's a lot of overlap with Ben 10 villains, but they all manage to feel unique in their own ways. Their theming is just so strong, it creates a really great blueprint for creating new villains. So in using that, I'm going to quickly come up with a concept for a villain using other villains as a basis for how to write him. So you've got our villain Grayson coming from a somewhat uncharted galaxy akin to the Andromeda system. To us, his homeworld is near unlivable. It's absolutely rich in natural resources, but the way the planet has formed makes using those resources particularly difficult. The entire surface of the planet is an ultra-dense forest with an almost unbreathable atmosphere. I'm imagining the air is so dense with nutrients that it's overwhelming to most species, which has led our villain of this arc's species to evolve to that environment. His species is able to make contact with any living thing, absorbing the energy from it and becoming more energized, able to then expend that energy or redistribute it, either creating new life in the forms of vegetation or in some instances non-sapient species, or sort of just bolstering their own strength while they have that energy on board. So it boils down to the more energy absorbed, the more physically capable of exerting themselves they are, and the more they're able to create from that sort of life energy. Amongst their species, there's a strong moral lesson about overconsumption and only taking as much as you require to help them all live. I'm realizing I'm coming up with another Ben 10 species that siphons off energy in some way or another, though the point of this video is analysing patterns in villains and using that as a blueprint. Back to it though. So Grayson here has decided to go off-world, which is typically not done of their species. They're so accustomed to their life-dense homeworld that going somewhere that they can't easily have access to that sort of nutrients-rich air and plant life at their fingertips is seen as nonsensical. Grayson, in wanting to rebel against their way of being, sets off and becomes his homeworld's first plumber, being stationed on Earth. Grayson, now living on Earth, is now nearly permanently exhausted, constantly needing to absorb vegetation and not getting enough energy from what a typical Earthling diet looks like. In so he's not doing very well as a plumber cadet. He's struggling with all physical tasks, though when he first arrived on Earth, it was easy enough for him. In so, he's starting to become more and more frustrated over months, starting to see things like the plumber power core as his ticket to not only replenishing himself, but as a way to gain more energy than he's ever dreamed of. After quite some time about fantasizing about this, he becomes desperate enough to break into the chamber that keeps the core, where he gets into a conflict with Ben and his Humungosaur transformation, who's overpowered this severely weakened version of Grayson so dramatically that Ben actually feels a bit guilty about it. Reaching out his hand to give Grayson a hand up, Grayson makes contact with Humungosaur, feeling all that Omni energy flowing through Ben. He starts draining him, which times out the Omnitrix and reverts Ben back to his human form. Grayson at this point, after absorbing the functional energy of a Vaxasaurian, Humungosaur species, has more energy in his body than he ever could have dreamed of. Physically now outmatching all the plumbers in the base he trained alongside, escaping the headquarters with his newfound energy, leaving the plumbers headquarters a absolute mess. I'm now imagining everyone licking their wounds, with the Omnitrix pinging saying new alien DNA sample acquired. Then you have a showdown between Ben and Grayson, Ben calling his transformation rework. I'm sort of borrowing there from how Ben was with the Halloween trio in the classic series, unlocking each of them after their first encounters. Then after defeating Grayson, Ben could either throw him in the null void where he could continue to feed off life, becoming more and more of a threat, or you could just put him in the plumber's holding facility and he can sit there and rot. Either way, eventually I imagine he escapes and there would be more showdowns. If you have any strong thoughts or feelings on anything I've spoken about today, I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching.